For a game that everyone's played, and sells millions of copies a year, Monopoly is a surprisingly terrible game. In any given game of Monopoly, you not only roll the dice countless times and take a bunch of cards from the random pools in the community chest and chance decks, but you also have to contend with other players messing up your strategy or coming into insane windfalls of cash by sheer dumb chance. Monopoly's randomness completely dictates who wins and who loses, and as a result it's very frustrating to play and is generally relegated to the bottom tier of any and all board game rankings. In fact, Monopoly's original iteration, the Landlord's game, which was developed by Elizabeth Magie, was intended to feel arbitrary and rage-inducing to make a point about the inherent unfairness of, you guessed it, monopolies. Randomness has blighted more modern games as well. Have you ever played a roguelike or survival game with randomly generated maps and found that, just by pure chance, you've been put in a virtually unwinnable situation through bullshit enemy spawns or a shortage of critical resources that leaves you to slowly starve to death? In these sorts of situations, the randomness isn't even really a surprise. Your inevitable loss was generated long before you even started playing. Of all the rage-inducing systems and tools that game designers use, randomness is among the most controversial. People rightly rail against loot boxes, which use frustration to manipulate us into spending cash, random mechanics like tripping in Super Smash Bros. Brawl, which makes competitive play almost impossible, and random generation of items and maps as a lazy alternative to tailor-made content. Some people, most notably the kind of nerd that still plays chess when Chess 2 has been out for years, think the randomness in games should be gotten rid of entirely, but I actually disagree. Though RNG is responsible for some of gaming's least fun experiences, it's also crucial for creating some of its best. Roguelikes, strategy games, RPGs and a bunch of other genres just wouldn't be possible if randomness weren't injecting a little bit of chaos in to keep us on our toes. Well-designed randomness can give us an infinite variety of situations to hone our skills and to help us tell almost completely emergent stories with moments of crushing failure followed by against the odds triumph. Believe it or not, randomness can even improve the competitive viability of games if used correctly. But what actually separates good randomness from bad randomness? It's just numbers at the end of the day, right? Well, it's actually quite simple. Note that in both of the examples I used about 2 minutes ago, as well as in the stereotypical RNG mechanics, randomness is frustrating either because you can't see it coming, or because you can't do anything about it. And I think that this is at the heart of the issue. Good randomness includes some degree of player agency, either giving you the ability to manipulate the randomness beforehand, or meaningfully respond to the outcome. Before I go in depth, let's quickly outline the different kinds of randomness, terms I've shamelessly stolen from Jeff Engelstein of Ludology. This guy coined a lot of the vernacular I'm going to be using today, and basically everyone who talks about randomness and game design on the internet is paraphrasing either his talks or his podcast. First, we have input randomness, which is randomness that occurs before you make a decision, like procedural generation of maps or randomly generated daily quest objectives in an MMO. If it's already happened before you get to do anything, it's probably input randomness. And second is output randomness, which occurs after you make a decision. This will be stuff like chances to hits or most loot systems. As you might expect, it's the opposite. If it happens in response to you doing something, it's output randomness. Then, added to those sensible and well thought out categories, we've got my haphazardly cobbled together definitions for controllable randomness, which is randomness that you can manipulate the result of, and reactable randomness, which is randomness that you can meaningfully respond to. I think these two are important to quantify, because they define our relationship with randomness in a subjective sense relevant to moment-to-moment gameplay, which offers a different perspective than the distant game designy lens of input and output, which don't always make sense on a granular level, but I'll get back to that. Let's start with reactable input randomness, because it's got the simplest psychology behind it. By randomizing things only before the player has a chance to interact with them, games are able to set up varied states of play and avoid creating frustrating surprises. Into the Breach is a game that feels incredibly fair, because although it's got a lot of randomness, from enemy spawns to map layouts to which items you'll find in the shops, it's all up front, and your decision making has no such grey areas. All the randomness is there to do is give your decisions an interesting context, and leave you to respond to the situation in whichever way you see fit. Games of strategy and planning are at their most fun when the player is able to plot a path to victory and then play out their intended solution, without needing to worry about part of their strategy suddenly falling apart or not having any options at all. To this end, Into the Breach is actually a little bit cheeky. In order to ensure that as many of its game states as possible are actually solvable, the game places enemies in particular places and throttles the amount that can spawn or attack at any given time, so as to prevent the annoying possibility of an alien destroying something and you literally not being able to do anything about it. By generating maps or levels too randomly, it's possible that players will end up being forced into boring or frustrating game states purely by dint of how the world is set up. Many strategy games can leave players at a massive disadvantage from turn 1 by not giving them access to crucial resources, and as I mentioned earlier, many survival games necessitate blind wandering just to find the resources you need to get started. In order to fix this, developers could design the maps by hand and remove the random element to exploration entirely, and this works very well in games like Subnautica, but only for the first playthrough. If every map was fixed and perfectly balanced in 4X's like Civilization, players would eventually be able to optimize all the fun out of expanding and constructing the right buildings at the right time very easily, and there'd be no incentive for players to trade or go to war because they'd already have everything they need. Instead, the best solution for fun maps is to randomize within limits. Terraria is a great example here. It generates mostly random maps, but positions more difficult biomes like the jungle or the dungeon far away, and never generates the infectious corruption or crimson too close to the spawn. This gives players the fun of exploring into mysterious terrain every time, but without overwhelming them before they've gotten a proper sword, or allowing skilled players to skip a bunch of progression without putting the work in. In the same vein, strategy games usually give players an equal amount of resources in their starting location, but never the same ones, meaning players will have to plan around shortages or deal with other players in order to get what they want, which is much more fun and interactive than sitting in a corner ticking off boxes on your optimized build order. Input randomness is also really helpful for games that test a player's skill and intellect, and this is where controllable input randomness comes in really handy. See, most competitive games don't have the absurd number of possible game states that, say, chess does, and so they need some degree of input randomness to vary things up and keep players on their toes. However, players also need some way to control this randomness and keep it within acceptable limits in order for competitive play to flourish. For example, in card games like Rummy, Crazy Eights, or Whist, the quality of your opening hand correlates massively with your likelihood of winning. And while some games can create some interesting decision making out of this limitation, like poker, even they are filled with dud hands or lucky insta-win flushes. More modern card games, most notably those from the Magic the Gathering lineage like Hearthstone or my personal favourite Eternal, fix this to some degree by giving players the ability to build their own deck of cards. Now, rather than your initial decision space being totally random, players are able to assemble their pool of cards as well as their overall strategy beforehand, turning simple RNG into something with a strong skill testing element. These games are of course still incredibly random, but giving players some say in what form that randomness ends up taking goes a long way towards cutting out a lot of the frustration of an obvious loss, because you know that you can probably improve your chances by building a better deck. Hidden role games like Secret Hitler also benefit from giving players the ability to control input randomness. Rather than each player's allegiance being determined separately, which could lead to groups of all bad guys or all good guys, good hidden role games let players choose a fixed number of bad guy roles, which then get distributed randomly, usually with hidden cards, leading to a much fairer game with much more interesting stakes. More modern styles of games benefit from controllable input randomness too. Warframe, a third-person shooter / grinding simulator, has a massive reliance on farming randomly spawned materials. Materials in Warframe spawn in procedurally generated maps for you to find and collect, but if it were possible for every map to be generated with any material, it would be really hard to find the one you actually want. So, quite cleverly, the devs gave each planet in the game its own, much more streamlined loot table, and let players manipulate the map gen by choosing which one they want to go to. That means in order to get plastids, for example, you'll need to go to Saturn, Phobos, Pluto, Eris, or Planet Bum, giving players a great reason to shake up the scenery every now and again, as well as making finding specific items that much easier. Of the two kinds of randomness, input is the less dynamic of the two, and it mostly serves to set up the parameters of the game before leaving players to get on with the rest. When input randomness works, it creates near infinite variety, but doesn't interfere with skill testing elements or strategic decision making, making it perfect for mastery driven or competitive titles. On the flip side, output randomness is all about constant change. By having the randomness take place after you've made a decision, players are forced to surrender a large portion of their own agency to a faceless, uncaring random number generator. As you might expect, this can cause a lot of problems. Have you ever been in a situation in an RPG where you've missed a crucial attack right at the last moment and gotten a game over? Yeah, that was the bad side of output randomness at work. But with a few small changes, punitive output randomness can be transformed into a great way to test players' skills of improvisation and risk management, as well as serve as a story generator for tales of tense recoveries and unlikely victories. In fact, it's this kind of randomness that all the best role-playing games rely on. And by that I mean, Dungeons and Dragons, not Final Fantasy. With a good dungeon master, or in the case of video games, a talented development team, even not getting the dice roll result you wanted can still lead to interesting storytelling opportunities. One of the best more recent video game examples of this is in Disco Elysium, where both successful and failed skill checks can have a massive impact on the story. In my first playthrough, I originally wanted to play as a smooth ladies' man detective, but after poor dice rolls caused me to royally screw up my very first attempt at doing just that, I then swore off women for good. Them dames are nothing but trouble, see? Later on, I completely lucked out on a conceptualization roll and ended up discovering spooky facts about the true nature of reality. Naturally, I put 2 and 2 together and spent the rest of the game role-playing as someone who thought that women were the cause of the coming apocalypse that is definitely for reals happening, a unique RP opportunity that never would have happened without some randomly driven inspiration. Deck-building roguelikes like Slay the Spire or One Step from Eden achieve the same sort of appeal on a more mechanical level. While these games are built around synergies and optimizing your deck of cards, you're never going to be able to get exactly what you want. The challenge of the game comes from improvising around what cards and passives you do get to create interesting emergent synergies on the fly. In One Step from Eden, a bullet hell grid-based roguelike RPG, it's Mega Man Battle Network for grown-ups. I ended up getting a bunch of abilities that hit a bunch of times, but didn't really synergize together. That all changed when I spotted some abilities that increase my spell power, which adds 1 damage to each hit of a spell. I'm sure you can see where this is going. It wasn't long before I quintupled my damage output and was rinsing bosses in no time at all thanks to my super killing machine gun spells. Reacting to randomness can create brilliant twists and turns that you can't see coming, but it's hard to turn this approach into something that feels like it requires actual planning. That's where controllable output randomness comes in. My beloved Xcom is a game that's famous for its brutal output randomness. A missed 80% shot can lead to a soldier you've spent ages developing getting filled full of lasers, but there's more to the game than hoping you don't get screwed by RNG. Thanks to the work of some clever developers, Xcom retains a lot of strategic depth by pitting players against RNG and allowing them to manipulate it. A large part of successful Xcom play is the ability for players to twist the odds in their favour and push their luck just far enough to win. Risk management is just as important a tactical skill as being able to calculate moves in advance. Playing too safe in Xcom by sticking to high cover and only taking high percentage shots will mean you'll get overwhelmed very quickly. Similarly, going miles out of your way to chase an incredibly unlikely single action multi-kill is more often than not going to lead to your troops becoming chrysalid food. The trick is knowing when to push your luck and when to hold back. Flanking enemies gives a substantial aim boost but can leave you out of position. Overwatch is more likely to hit than a shot into high cover, but it fails if an enemy doesn't move. Xcom sees you making loads of these tiny micro decisions every turn to maximize your chances based on constantly shifting parameters. Also, something that Xcom players have to consider is knowing when to eliminate randomness entirely. Grenades and melee attacks, both of which come with some pretty hefty restrictions, can offer either guaranteed damage or can change both allied and enemy hit chances, and knowing when and where to alter randomness is often much more powerful than simply relying on getting lucky because you're in control. And really, that's just as true for developers as it is for players. Randomness is an incredibly powerful tool in the game designer's arsenal, but regardless of which type of randomness you use, or how you choose to let players interact with it, randomness needs to be constrained, and to ultimately serve the player experience. Sometimes that means altering the variance of a random outcome such that it only helps the player, other times that means using it to impede them in order to make a point, and in a few specific scenarios, players might even need to be lied to about the random chances in their game to make the experience more fun. Critical strikes in Dota, for example, are weighted pseudo-randomly, meaning that every time you don't get a critical, the chance you will get one is increased. This is absolutely not how the real maths should work, but it instinctively feels right to our rubbish brains, and ends up being much more fun than going ages without getting a critical hit at all. This is a change that also lowers the variance of the mechanic, helping competitive players too. Even terms like input and output randomness don't really work when viewed from a subjective lens. I said card drawing at the start of your turn was input randomness, but you could argue it's actually the output randomness resulting from decisions you made during deck building. Same for accuracy in Xcom. You missing your shot could actually just be input randomness informing your decisions for the next turn. Randomness is a very complicated subject, and it's tempting for developers to let it run amok. After all, as we can see in loot boxes or games with bad randomness like Monopoly, even horrendously imbalanced games with no player agency can still manage to trip our dopamine receptors and be fun occasionally. But in order to craft something more than a simple Skinner box, or a boring algorithm that spits out unfun levels, developers need to consider the player's role in the experience, and players also need to gain a bit of perspective. Randomness is sort of inherently unfair, but just because something is uncertain, that doesn't mean that it can't be skill testing or isn't worth playing. The trick to figuring out whether a game has good or bad randomness isn't to go on your gut emotional response, because the fact that randomness often doesn't work in the player's favour is exactly why it's so powerful. Instead, we need to keep a sense of objectivity and see if that little bit of uncertainty made the game more fun, tactical, or emotionally resonant in the long run. Only by understanding the nuances of our relationship with chance will we be able to clear its bad name, as well as know which kinds of randomness to avoid. Basically what I'm saying is that there's about a 60% chance that randomness isn't bullshit and you're just bad at video games, and there's 2-to-1 odds of me telling the truth or not there. And you can only know if I've been telling the truth after you've liked, commented and subscribed, but only if your like is an even number. Hello, hi, how are you? Thank you for watching. Apologies for this video coming out a little bit later than usual. I've been working on a bigger project that just happened to eat up a bunch more of my time than I thought it would. My bad. As for my recommendation for a cool YouTube thing you should maybe check out, I usually recommend stuff from channels that are smaller than mine, but this one's pretty close. I recently watched Barry Kramer's A Good Enough Summary of Kingdom Hearts, and despite having played a few of the games, I was amazed by how little of the story I actually understood, insofar as Kingdom Hearts' story can be comprehended by the minds of mere mortals, of course. It's very fun, it's got some cute animations, you should go and watch it if that sounds interesting. But, of course, the real stars of the show are my wonderful patrons. If you want to support the channel in this era where YouTube ad revenue is plummeting like a rock, then you can do it via Patreon. There's a link in the description and in the comments. In return, you'll get a little look behind the scenes with update videos, cut bits from the script, and maybe, perhaps, a sneak peek at what I've got planned for the 200 subs video. Ooh. Also, if you donate $10 a month, you'll get your name read out at the end of the video, like these wonderful people, who are Alex Deloch, Alexander Kramer, Asaran, Aula94, Baxter Heel, Big Chess, Bodhi, Brian Atariani, Daniel Medjes, David Duatrascu, Dirk Jan Karambeld, Doodlehog, Evie, Ibathon, Jordan, Joshua Binswanger, Kai Gillespie, Lee Berman, Lucas Slack, Lunar Eagle 1996, Mace Window 54, Max Filipov, Michael Kunk, Mr. T with some tea, Patrick Romberg, Philby the Bilby, Prospero, Ray's Dad, Samuel Vanderplatz, Sheldon Hearn, Steve Riley, Strateger in Ultima, and Chow. Okay, thanks for watching, stay safe out there, and I will see you around. Bye!